thanks so much for meeting with me.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Most
I'm
happy
looking
to.
forward to getting to know a bit more about you and what it is that you do exactly and how we're all connected. Tell me about yourself.
I'm what they call a software entrepreneur.
Okay.
Um, so I have started companies, I've sold some, I've been the CTO of some, I've worked at a big company that went public. So I've been on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I am an investor in a few small companies, an advisor to, I think, 6 or 7 right now, including Echosec.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm sort of one of those weird crossover people where I have a technical background, but I've also done a lot of work as an executive and in sales and in marketing strategy. And so I do a lot of the back and forth between those domains.
How did you get into doing what you do? Where did you start?
I started writing software when I was 6, and I was very antisocial when I was small, and I was mostly focused on like the software side.
Hmm.
Um, and I did web design starting in high school.
Hmm.
And then after high school, I started doing web applications. So the early, like, hey, we connected a database to a web page, and what does that do? And how do we do that? I did e-commerce in like 95, 96, so very early e-commerce.
Hmm.
Um, but like in the early days, you sort of, if you're building software, you have to do the front end and the back end and customer requirements and run it and operate, so I had sort of done full life cycle stuff. And then I ran off and joined a gaming startup in 2000. So I worked in video games for a couple of years, which taught me a lot about the difference between working on a hard problem or working on the right problem.
Hmm.
There's a lot of video game problems that are very hard and not important. People spend a lot of time building things that are super hard and complicated and interesting to work on and don't make a game that anyone wants to buy.
Hmm.
So I learned a lot in video game programming around like what a good piece of software is from the user's perspective. It was doing Netscape and then the other stuff with AOL that I started really getting into what we called sales engineering at the time, which was working with the customer to figure out what they wanted and what the product needed to be to make that happen. And so I worked on a bunch of stuff with AOL Time Warner. There's the AOL Instant Messenger toolbar and the Netscape browser and some other cool, weird things we did, bringing Netcaster back and stuff. Mostly doing like sales engineering and then product management and then tech lead as the teams came up. It was like, well, this is what we're going to build and this is how we spec it. So build this thing. And then I would go work on the next project. And then I was lucky. I got into Silicon Valley stuff at good timing. So I was at Tapulous for the launch of the App Store for the first iPhone.
Hmm.
And we were an Apple Design Award winner and launch partner. So I got to be part of the App Store launch and really see like, what is that from a partner ecosystem standpoint? How does Apple deal with their ecosystem? What do marketplaces look like? How do they work?
Hmm.
Uh, and the App Store was interesting because it was very consumer focused. It was a hip, cool consumer product that then over time also became an enterprise product. Smartphones became part of what worked in the enterprise. Then I went to NASA for a couple of years.
Wow.
And I was the first cloud architect for NASA, which was, it was like a tech trend that geeks could see coming and business people had heard about, but they were in two different worlds. So my job was mostly like helping bureaucrats understand what cloud was
Hmm.
and why they needed it, and then helping engineers understand what government was and why it had certain requirements. So building, and then what we started there became OpenStack, which is like this really famous open source project that now has like 50,000 contributors and 100 company members, and it runs the atom smashers at CERN and like hospitals all over the world and stuff. It became a thing.
So you've got your software and then you've got your sales and then you've got, your understanding of just different industries and your ability to just connect all of those things is kind of what makes you a unique key player, right? In all of these
Yeah.
endeavors.
Yeah, I call it like silo busting. Like people that don't speak the same language then tend to live in the world with the people who speak their language,
Hmm.
and it becomes us and them. right? And it's like, oh, the engineers hate sales. I was like, well, it doesn't have to be that way. You just need a common language and a common understanding of like sales is trying to make the company successful. You're trying to make the company successful. You have a shared goal. You just need to understand how you each view the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a lot of it is about the timeline, right? And engineers want to finish the thing they're working on today and have it done tomorrow, and salespeople want their sales to close this quarter, and the company has growth goals at the year schedule, and so all of these timelines are out of whack. So you just have to help people make things line up.
Mm-hmm.
My mental model for startups is mostly about alignment. And this is the thing I got from video games. The lesson I got from video games is really funny. I'm going to tell you anyway. It's a brilliant game is what they call balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that it's not too hard or too easy. It's that the graphics and the sound and the gameplay and the storyline and the cutscenes all feel equally good. So you don't have a game that's got like beautiful graphics, but it's really clunky,
Mm-hmm.
or it's got like really smart AI, but the soundtrack is terrible, or, like an unbalanced game is not fun. So by that definition, one of the best games ever made was Super Metroid. It just like, hey, it was 8-bit graphics, 8-bit sound. It was a Nintendo classic. Like it's not but it's still so fun to play because the balance of all those things, the way they used the graphics with the gameplay, with the storyline and the surprise bits and the use of color, and it's just super well balanced. So a company that's running really well, the product and sales are really well connected, and it feels really logical of like, here's what's on our roadmap, but we're building it so that we can get into these markets and make these customers happy.
Mm-hmm.
Here's how engineering is working, and here's the amount of time they're spending on technical debt so that operations gets easier versus the amount of time they're spending on new features. Here's our marketing, and here's how it's connected to the story that the sales are the salespeople are telling, and the unique things that have happened in the last year. So our product features, our marketing story, our sales are connected.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what we're doing at an all company level in terms of fundraising and our corporate message and how we're positioning with investors. And that's how it's taking advantage of the marketing story we're telling. And it's well aligned with the sales story. Like all these things line up, then everything you're doing starts being multiplicative, right? So instead of, oh, we built one feature and we got one customer, we built one feature, we got a new category of customers. We
Mm-hmm.
got one piece of collateral and it won us 20 deals. Where you're spending your time fixing problems should be connected to where you're landing big deals. And they feel like your problems are all in one space and your deals are all in another.
Mm-hmm. What are you working on right now?
I'm doing diversity and inclusion software. So basically micro coaching to help managers be less douchebaggy.
Mm-hmm.
Building software, iPhone and Android apps. So the app sort of has a learn section where there's these short 90-second videos of like lessons of understanding bias, and then a practice section where managers commit to practicing certain categories of behavior change. And then they get little notifications, push notifications right before meetings that suggest single things to try,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like try asking everyone in the meeting for their feedback by name so that everyone has a chance to speak. It's a really simple thing that most managers don't know to do. And they don't realize this becomes part of gender and racial bias is how this plays out, is who gets called on to speak or who just goes ahead and speaks
Mm-hmm.
maps to discrimination. So then they say, yes, I want to try this, or no, I don't. They get this like 5 minutes before the meeting. And if they say, yes, go ahead, I want to try this, then after the meeting, the members of the team get a little survey thing that says something like, hey, Bill's working on soliciting input from everyone. Is he succeeding? How did this go? And you go, no, actually, he sucked. I didn't get to speak. He doesn't get that feedback directly, but
Mm-hmm.
we aggregate feedback so that over time he gets to see trends. You're like, hey, you're really not improving in this thing. You're doing better on this other thing.
That's
And then there's, badges and scores of like, how are you doing? And you win stuff. So that's one of a bunch of products. That's the main product, basically. And we have that for Android as well. So I've been building software, doing the research to flesh out, what are these lessons? So there's, a literature review that took us 3 months of every science study
mm-hmm.
ever done on gender and racial bias and what changes it, what actually changes outcomes as opposed to what people feel good about yelling about.
So what do you see in a post-COVID future for the world of business and the world of tech?
That is a great question. Do you want my optimistic answer or my pessimistic answer?
Both.
Okay. My optimistic answer is actually somewhat pessimistic in that basically um, the world as it is not going to go back to normal. So there will be lots of people that don't have the jobs they used to have that will be looking for new ways to be employed. And we will have a renaissance of home-based business.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to look really interesting. I think it'll be distributed piecework in a certain sense of like, what can people make from home that is kind of like a mini part of a distributed assembly line? I don't know if that's 3D printers or knitting or whatever, but we saw some of this with masks, people making masks and selling them on Etsy and Shopify shops. And like that space, I think will break down some of the barriers between like the freedom that knowledge workers have to work from wherever, like from your van and go to Port Alberni, and the like chain to a desk, like service industry and traditional manufacturing jobs. So I think we might see an interesting renaissance in that. What that means for tech companies really is there's a lot of tech that was Gen 1 that has very quickly gone to Gen 3, right? Like Zoom. Zoom is now, it's like the Google of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that everybody's on Zoom all the time. Everyone knows what Zoom is and how to use it and why to use it and what to use. And so I think Zoom is now not a place to go build a business, but adjacencies to Zoom now are really obvious. Like, what are all the tools that people need to, like, I've been watching my kids' teachers try and teach over Zoom, and they don't even know how to control the mute button. You know, like they can unmute themselves, but they can't, like, they're not, it's not smooth. It's not built for that audience. It's not built for that use case. So I don't think anyone displaces Zoom, but I think there's all of this opportunity for like, what are the plugins? What are the training courses? How does this get fleshed out? There'll be another renaissance of like, how does more of the economy get into the tech economy, right? How do more people get to build software, write software, sell software, understand software, work with software? I don't know that that turns into more of the low code, no code movement, because they always think they're going to win there and they usually don't. But I think there's an opportunity for new mental models.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of like, nobody loves the comparison, but I love HyperCard, right? HyperCard and FileMaker were amazingly powerful at enabling a generation of people to sort of be programmers and solve their own problems in a bunch of interesting places where software helped. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm kind of curious, like, what are the new things no one's conceived of in that space that happen in the next year? The other thing that's going to happen, our notions of globalization are up for review.
Mm-hmm.
You know, partly that's climate crisis and people just saying it doesn't make sense to ship everything from China. Like, we're taking advantage of the exploitation of cheap labor elsewhere. Maybe that's ethically irresponsible. Plus, then we're transporting raw goods to one place and manufacturing goods back the other way, and the environmental toll of that is just kind of silly.
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to see the cracks in those supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we see a global pandemic, what does that do to supply chains? Maybe we rethink some of that from a resilience standpoint. So economies might decide that resilience is more important than efficiency, which means we're going to pay more for goods that are local. It's like 100-mile diet, but for everything.
Mm-hmm.
That might have some pretty dramatic effects on the labor markets in general. And so there are opportunities, I think, in how we think about labor and tooling around labor and supply chain and logistics. I was talking to some other very smart folks in the last couple of weeks who are really excited about supply chain software in the post-COVID world.
Mm-hmm.
I think in general, just a resilience lens on all software is pretty interesting. You know, what does it mean to measure and care about your resilience? So this is all my optimistic view. My optimistic view is that things change,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and it's funny for me to say lots of people out of work is my optimism.
Yeah.
Because I think it creates a lot of opportunity. It's like the Medici Renaissance, right?
Mm-hmm.
My pessimistic view is that we all really desperately want to get back to the status quo of being wage slaves and the companies all want to get back to the status quo of having wage slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so the business opportunities are about mitigation. Like, how do we go back to normal without really going back to normal, right? So lots of remote work, but it's not really about empowering remote work. It's just about surveillance state remote work,
Mm-hmm.
like the manager's anxiety that if they're not watching people, they're not doing work,
Mm-hmm.
becomes all of these, well, how do I have more and more telepresence? And I've seen this play out in remote offices before where everyone wants cameras everywhere all the time, and it gets weird. So I think there's just very pandemic related or health anxiety related markets that are interesting. I do think the healthcare space has been ripe for disruption for a long time, right? The big pharma meets how the payer and insurer relationship are managed, meets the group insurance copay arrange, all of that stuff. I think what they call sort of health tech, new health tech,
Mm-hmm.
could be really interesting. Maybe the other one is the aging population, right? Like, we know that there's this amazing cohort of the above 60
Mm-hmm.
that are savvy and capable of being productive, and they're an underutilized resource, and they're also at threat right now because of the pandemic. So they're top of mind in an interesting way. Post-pandemic, what we were calling the kind of the millennial crunch, right? There's a generation of people who are now between 30 and 40, can't afford a house, haven't had the career path they really thought they deserved, have the education, still have the student debt, have delayed having children because of all of these other things.
Mm-hmm.
They are now the most important demographic. And I think in a lot of ways, the pandemic has just showed them that nobody gives a about them, and they're going to have to do it for themselves. That
Mm-hmm.
there is no social safety net. The state is not going to step in really in a meaningful way. And if they are, it's only going to be a Band-Aid for which they're expected to say thank you instead of actually equity.
What do you see for Echosec in a post-COVID future in terms of
Oh,
our tools and our product?
yeah, that's a more specific question. Echosec has forks in the road, and they will always have forks in the road. The new sets of threats, the threat intelligence that becomes increasingly interesting, are these intersections of a lack of resilience, a lack of economic resilience in certain geos. So if you take a global manufacturer like a Ford,
Mm-hmm.
somebody, and you say, hey, where are your supply chains brittle?
Mm-hmm.
Where are there single suppliers of key components that they don't have the economic deep pockets to keep going in a crisis? And what are you going to do to change those relationships? A lot of that data actually looks like the kind of data Echosec is good at dealing with,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's geospatially focused. It's a mix of things that are difficult to integrate and things that are easy to integrate. So structured and unstructured formats. There's some machine learning training that's required on certain kind of sets, and just good parsing and cleaning on other sets.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's an opportunity to say, hey, if you want to be the threat intelligence company for key businesses, and your buyer is, GRC, Global Risk and Compliance, you can just get incredibly broad as these companies start to consider how they grapple with all of these major threats, right? Supply
Mm-hmm.
chain risk, economic risk, pandemic risk. If it's more about the opportunities than the threats, and there was this moment in time when Echosec was all about, hey, if we know what people are saying in a Burger King,
Mm-hmm.
every specific Burger King, that sentiment data is valuable for Burger King, but also for Wendy's, and
Mm-hmm.
who wants it. And so the opportunity landscape then becomes, if there's a shift from globalization, how are you looking at shifting market opportunities? And again, it's that synthesis of, social data, and really, like, your backbone is the social data, the dark web data, the geo data.
Mm-hmm.
How can you add very small amounts of other economic data? That, like, so you become the Bloomberg terminal of threat or the Bloomberg terminal of opportunity as opposed to the Bloomberg terminal of market.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
if you think about that definition, Bloomberg is an insanely valuable company because those licenses are $30,000 a seat.
Mm-hmm.
You think of a floating license model at $30,000 a seat, that is a beautiful business. And then most of your company is about continually adding to the value of that terminal by figuring out what data sources you're aggregating and how you're presenting it. There's also the totally dystopian future where the pandemic wipes out a very large percentage of the population, and there's such economic scarcity that then there's a whole group that's just like rioting and looting. And so these very specific physical threat intelligence becomes the key driver, and you go really, really fast in the next 3 months, and you help every police department in the world figure out how to stay on top of this stuff.
I've thought of that actually.
I hope we don't go to like straight up zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, no, me neither. But if we do, then, we can stay on top of it.
Yeah, yeah, it would be
I'll be
nice.
sitting here in my camper van monitoring all of the social media posts.
Totally,
That'll be
totally. Like, there's somebody with a gun nearby.
Well, I hope not. Well, thanks so much for your time. I
Absolutely.
appreciate you answering all my questions, and it was really nice to get to know you and what you do. And I look
Sure.
forward to connecting more.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks so
Look
much.
forward. Cheers.
Take care.